You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Steven Hilding. We're going to talk about political micro-targeted campaigns, which I think will be really interesting. Steve handles the RMC's internal operations and serves as a right hand to the founder, Rory McShane. And he also advises clients, helping them develop strategies and targeting that they need to get the votes they need. So welcome, Steven.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. Were you always interested in political matters, and how did you get involved in the work you're doing today?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been involved in politics my whole professional life. I had my first paid job on a political campaign when I was 17 years old and still in high school. Throughout college, worked on political campaigns as well. Owned my own firm for a time, couldn't survive the off cycle and came on with then McShane LLC, now named RMC, Revolutionizing Microtargeted Campaigns. I serve as our vice president, oversee all of our staff and help advise our clients.
Oh, so you said no off season, meaning in between the 4-year presidential cycle or what?
Just in between a 2-year election cycle with, when having your own firm in this business, right? You're really, everything that you do in this cycle is kind of cyclical on a 2-year cycle. So everything you do in the whole business is based on that cycle. So you plan your whole life in 2-year segments at a time. So, came out of an off cycle with my own company. It was really hard to survive that kind of off time when you don't have a lot of busy elections.
Yeah, it makes sense. So things go quiet for like 2 whole years. I would think that candidates would always be scheming and building and working on stuff.
And that's definitely true. And that's one of the things as a larger firm, we're very busy right now and we're only, about, just almost done with the first quarter of the off year of an election cycle. What of some people might even consider an off election cycle because it's not a presidential year. And we're very busy. I mean, we've got clients across the country that are running for 2026, some 2025 races that we have as well, but most of them are 2026 races. Okay.
And there's a lot of people out there for races that cover a whole state or the whole country. Why would you need micro-targeting?
That's a really good question, Richard. This comes from on the Republican side of campaigns. Republicans have always been kind of behind the ball on modern technology when it comes to political campaigns. So you really saw in the 2008 election cycle, the Democratic Party and the Obama campaign start to use big data in a real way for the first time. And it took Republicans a few election cycles to catch up to them. So now this is widely used by both sides. It's all about finding the right voters, the voters that you need. Say you're one of my clients and you're running in a Republican primary. That's what you have to do before you get to the general election. There are, say you have 100 voters in a district. Of those voters, maybe only 30 of them will be registered Republicans. Of those, maybe only half of them will vote in Republican primaries, right? What we're looking to do is basically putting as much lead on as few targets as possible.
Well, I would think that this goes into the theory of swing voters and people that have made up their mind. So I guess if you look at it from like an 80-20 perspective, I guess that the vital few is what will swing an election, or like why is there, again, micro-targeting?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's about those vital few that are going to make a difference, right? In a competitive race, say a competitive congressional race, these races are going to be decided by 1, 2, 3 percentage points. So it's a bigger question than why just micro-targeting. So what I kind of want to do is dive into what is micro-targeting for political campaigns. In simply put, it's the process of using big data to make informed decisions about your voters. This is taking the kind of consumer data that big companies, Fortune 500 companies that are making large-scale corporate decisions are using, and we're taking that same kind of corporately available data and using it on political campaigns. So historically, when you had, say, information on a voter, data on a voter, in the old school days when we had voter rolls, when they were quite literally rolls of the voters, there's a famous picture of Karl Rove working on then Governor George W. Bush's campaign in Texas, standing with the voter rolls of the campaign. And it quite literally was a couple library shelves of Texas voters. within these data roles. And so the kind of information that we had at the time was things like name, phone number, mailing address. Maybe there was some information about which elections you'd voted in the past, but there was nothing like that. So the kind of data that we use today is over 200 commercially available data points, pairing that on top of all the elections data, party registration, frequency that they vote, and then taking this consumer data, taking things like, do you rent or own your home? What kind of vehicle do you drive? Is it an American-made vehicle? What kind of credit cards do you carry? How much equity do you have in your home? All these different questions that when you look at them once at a time, say things like going to the movie theater or eating fast food, you can't really make a picture of a voter. It doesn't really make sense to look at just one data point. But when we're able to put all of these together, we're able to make large, broad-scale decisions. So we're able to tell with a high degree of certainty that voters who feel about a certain issue have all of these socioeconomic data points in common. So we can say with a high degree of certainty, we know which voters say support President Trump or supported Vice President Harris in the last election, which voters are pro-Second Amendment and which ones maybe aren't so much, which voters are pro-life and which are pro-choice. And so with these, we're able to make very strategic targeting decisions.
But how do you know that all these micro features would add up to a vote for a certain individual? And what if one of them are off or two of them are off? Then what?
Certainly, there's going to be some off, but you know what? I would rather feel confident in this data, knowing, making these broad scale decisions. Sure, there's always going to be, folks that maybe aren't modeled correctly, right? Maybe we think someone, supports a certain issue when they feel a different way, or maybe we send a mail piece to a household where we're trying to target one voter and another voter in the household looks at it. But what I can certainly say is that you're better off if you're thinking about a voting audience of 100 voters. I'm going to go back to this 100 number just because the math is easy. If I know that, there are essentially 5 voters out of that 100 that are going to make up the election, I would be much better off hitting those 5-10 voters 10 times over than I would be hitting all of the voters once. There are voters that candidates can reliably count in their camp. Republicans who always vote Republican, Democrats who always vote Democrat. Those we can count as either supporting our candidate or not supporting our candidate. And what the goal is to do is constantly be identifying the voters in our ecosystem, which ones are supporting us, which ones are supporting our opponent, and then kind of bringing it down to the very last one. So what we're trying to do is put as much lead on as few targets as possible, trying to make the most informed decisions as possible versus wasting campaign dollars, wasting resources, wasting time targeting folks whose votes we're never going to win.
Well, I know secret sauce is, major in this, but what can you say? Like what factors, maybe even one that, if a factor changes, then you think the vote will change or, is key to someone voting a certain way?
Generally, we're making broader scale pictures than this. We're not looking at one individual factor in these. We're just making broader scale pictures. So we can say, let's say we have 250 available data points on these folks. Our algorithm will say they're likely to agree with this issue if they agree with a range between X number and X number of these things. They have X number of these things in common. So generally, it's more broad stroke than that, right? We're generally looking at a larger audience and not narrowing down into the individual as much.
Yeah, but you are. I mean, you're going after a vital few. So I would think if you're spending so much time on a vital few people, you must be able to see when things change. Like in this recent election, recent presidential election, it looked like, the black vote changed a lot. The Latino vote changed a lot. Like, were you able to analyze and find out why?
A lot of, I'll answer that one. That one is less something that's determined in consumer data, right? What they were able to do is it's certain like you said, the black vote. It was really black men that moved over. Black women did not move. They kind of stayed as a strong Democratic base. It was the black men that moved over, and it was less than that. It was black men that did not turn out for Harris than it was that did turn out for Trump. So targeting those, that's a low propensity voter, right? Those are voters that aren't very commonly targeted. And so you had outside spending groups the 2024 election was the first time that a presidential campaign kind of outsourced its field operations. So the President Trump's campaign was not as focused on knocking doors as it was in 2020 and 2016. It had groups like America PAC, Elon Musk Super PAC, and other groups like that that kind of put in the work in the field in turning out those low propensity voters. So with that, again, it's certainly more of a broad stroke decision. You're talking, certainly it's a select percentage of the population, but you're talking in a statewide, even in a lower population swing state like here in Nevada where I am, you're talking tens of thousands of votes that are making the difference. There is no way to be as granular as going down to each and every individual voter.
All right, so if you look at it as a curve, you're not focused on, what percentage of the voting public are you focused on? Like 1%, 10% at most? Like how small is the sea at large, is it?
That's a really interesting question, and it totally depends on the race. It totally depends on the geography, right? Say for example, if I'm running a congressional race in a presidential year, the voters in the middle are certainly going to be a much larger percentage of the voter electorate than, say, a special election for a municipal race. So it depends on the race, but generally I would say that in a swing district, you're probably looking at really heavily targeting in a general election, probably about 5 to potentially 10% of the electorate, very heavily. You'll do some smaller targeting and stuff to groups outside of that, but that's going to be the base of your kind of turnout and mobilization of kind of marginal voters.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's typically what, thousands, tens of thousands? Like what is the ballpark range, small to large for a cohort that you will study?
In a congressional race and primaries, we're generally targeting, depending on and again, it's really hard to say because even all congressional districts are supposed to be, about the same size. But some of them, the primary base is so different compared to others. So it's really hard to say. I would say if you're looking at like our standard kind of Republican congressional primary, we're probably targeting between 30 and 60,000 voters, depending on the district. And then when we get into a general election, we're going to be targeting a bit more than that.
So, that's still a lot. Are you able to do more advanced statistics? It sounds like you still have a very large number of people. It'll be statistically significant. What's the benefit of operating in this range versus operating with a lot more people?
Sure. You essentially what you're doing is just spending your campaign dollars as wisely as possible, right? Say if you're a Democratic candidate, you're never going to spend your money targeting the Republicans who are voting in every single Republican primary because they're just never going to vote for a Democratic candidate. That just isn't going to happen. So, and then there's same, if you're a Democratic candidate, you also know that you've got the vote in the bag of the Democratic voter who voted in every of the last 4 Democratic primaries and every of the last 4 general elections, right? So there are folks that we know for sure, in most races, we can say for sure that at least 60 to 70% of the voters, we know exactly where their vote is going.
All right. So, a lot of elections, it'll be along county lines, state lines, et cetera. So you go for, I guess, do you look at these individual people on multiple levels? Do you look at someone on a city level that's part of a special voting group, or how far down do you look? How close do you look? How far away do you raster out? How do you decide what to look at? Or do you look at, again, cohorts just in many, many different ways?
Sure. I generally base it on the geography of the election. So if it's a countywide election, I generally don't focus, say, as much on an individual city, right? If I'm running a countywide election, my candidates from an individual city, generally I wouldn't target that city heavier. Generally what I do is I say, I basically start with who are the voters that I want? Are they primary voters? Are they general voters? Depending on what the race is. So say it's a general election. I say, okay, I want my general election voters. So give me people that are likely to vote in general elections. So we're going to assign a turnout score to them of 1 to 100, 100 being the people that they turn out in every single election. There could be a bomb go off and they're still going to vote. In 0 being people who have never voted. They're registered to vote, but they've never cast a ballot once in their life. So generally, we're going to look to target the higher propensity voters because those are the folks that are turning out. And unless you're a presidential race or maybe a U.S. Senate race, you don't really have the resources to turn out low propensity voters. That's just not something that campaigns have the resource to do. Now, President Trump had the advantage of all of the super PACs and the presidential campaign kind of funding that allowed his campaign to do that this cycle. but most campaigns don't have that. So we're looking at higher propensity voters. Depending on the circumstances, we're generally looking at voters that have a score of 60 to 70 or higher. So a higher likelihood of voting, right? 70%, 60 to 70% or higher likelihood of voting. So we're going to start with those individuals, and then we're going to refine from there. So if I'm a Republican candidate, the very first thing I want to do are eliminate the Democrats that are never going to vote for me out of that voter pool. So I'm going to take out all of my hardcore Democrat voters. So I'm going to take out all of the Democrat voters who routinely vote in Democratic primaries. And then I'll probably keep all of the Republicans as a separate universe. And then I'll take what I'll call the weak Democrats in the independent voters, and then I'll issue model them. So what we're going to do is there are what we would say as a Republican candidate, more traditionally conservative issues that some Democrats and independents will agree with. So what we'll do is we'll do an issue model. So an issue that might be popular in a place is economic anxiety, right? So what we'll say is target Democrat and independent voters who have some economic anxiety, and we'll tell them that our candidate is the one who's got the fiscally conservative message that's going to get them through. Or any number of issues. If we have pro-gun voters, we're going to put pro-gun content in front of those voters. So the goal is that we're putting issues that we know this small pool of voters already agree with, and putting that in front of them and letting them know that our candidate is the candidate that supports the issue that they already agree with.
Yeah, it seems like an interesting cohort would be people that don't automatically vote down ballot along with the top winner to influence them. Like if you feel like they're lost, but you still have a candidate that's down ballot that you want to win, that might be like an interesting group to go after again.
Absolutely. And that's going to be a critical voter base for this upcoming election cycle. So there are 13 Republicans who underperformed President Trump in their congressional districts. So there are now 13 Democrats who are sitting in Trump performing districts that the Republicans were not able to win, though President Trump won in their district. And the key to that is mobilizing these down ballot voters, whether it was that they didn't agree with the House candidates down ballot, whether it was they didn't vote. That's going to be key in mobilizing voters for this election cycle. Control of the House is going to be determined by a handful of seats. The Republicans have a pretty good Senate map, but the Democrats are certainly going to try and make a play, and they're certainly going to be on the defensive. It's certainly going to be about those voters. And then which of those voters can we then turn out in a midterm election cycle?
Is the net effect that you guys are able to get more people to vote that otherwise wouldn't vote at all? Or, what do you see?
So generally speaking, campaigns do not have the resources to engage with voters who do not usually vote. The highest likelihood and the highest indicator of someone's voting performance is their past voting performance. So it's very, very difficult to take a voter who's never voted or has maybe voted in one of the last 4 general elections, getting them to turn out. That's very difficult. So what we're really exerting our resources on are the people who we already know are going to come out and vote, in creating our voter base based out of the folks that we know are coming out.
Gotcha. Again, can you share any stories? I mean, redact as much as you like, but what's some juicy details on a group of people you were able to influence?
Yeah, there are all kinds of interesting circumstances. I'll do a little bit of bragging on one of our clients this past election cycle. So we worked with the Wyoming Freedom Caucus and their associated PAC, the Wyoming Freedom PAC. We worked with their candidates. We had 19 successful victories that we delivered for their candidates, all members of the Freedom Caucus. Some of those were protecting incumbents, some were electing new members. And so what we did, we had some nasty articles written about us in the state of Wyoming. There were articles that said that basically what I'm telling you, that we're using big scary data. And so we have the advantage of races in Wyoming tend to be very inexpensive races. A state house campaign expends maybe $10,000 as an entire campaign budget, as compared to a larger state like Florida, Texas. It's not uncommon for these campaigns to expend $250,000 plus. So what we were able to do is bring this kind of data in targeting that used to only be available to big races, to really congressional races or higher. Any race that's going to spend over $1 million was kind of who this data was available to. So how we've kind of made our mark in the industry is bringing this kind of data down to these smaller races. So what we were able to do is deliver those 19 wins for our clients. We took out a 20-year incumbent, committee chairman, 19 victories across state just by using this data. So once we did this data, we were targeting these folks with pretty traditional methods, right? We targeted them with mail, and we did a little bit of digital and a little bit of text messaging. Very traditional methods. But what we did is we knew the voters that were going to turn out, and our client, being the Freedom Caucus, the conservatives. So we wanted to only target the most conservative voters in each of their districts, and there aren't a whole lot of voters in a Wyoming State House district, and that's how we were able to be so successful. So what we were able to do after that is Wyoming is the first state that didn't have a majority of their Republican caucus as Freedom Caucus. They had a majority of the House of Representatives as Freedom Caucus.
Okay. How is this reshaping elections and, the electioneering around them? And I don't know, what are some ways that you found that are, you were able to target people? Are you using a lot of social media? Are you able to get data from social media because, you deal with political campaigns that other people wouldn't? Like what data is available to you, I guess, that isn't available to others? And, how do you see this reshaping elections now going forward?
That's a really good question, Richard. And that's one that I'm really excited about too. It's not as much, what data are we getting from social media or anything? It's kind of what data are we feeding to social media? In the old ways of campaigning, right? A traditional campaign was who can put as many points on broadcast television as possible. And that's how kind of old school congressional races were won. And that's how congressional races were won in the 1990s and early 2000s. In some folks who have made a name in this industry and might almost be close to household names, that's how they made their market campaigns, and that's how campaigns were won. And in this day and age, what we'll do is we'll take our targeted list of voters and we'll target them on all kinds of different mediums. So all of the streaming ads that you see, all of everything from, watching a free streaming service to one of the paid ones, Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, Roku, any of those, we can target just to individuals on there. So you're going to see campaigns, a campaign, if they have $100,000 that they would normally put on television, they're going to say, let's put it on streaming service ads targeted just to our individual voter, right? Television is moves numbers, regular traditional broadcast and cable television move numbers faster than just about any other form of media that there is. But it's also incredibly expensive and it's not targeted, right? You'll be very hard pressed to find, say, a congressional district that is entirely within one broadcast zone. So what you're going to see is campaigns becoming more and more targeted. They're going to be targeted with anything that can be one-to-one targeted to an individual voter. Anything like a text message, a robocall, streaming service ads, social media ads, browser ads, mail, still traditional methods like mail, door knocking, volunteer phone calling. Those methods are still going to be utilized. They're just going to be more targeted as to who they're going to.
What about instead of only targeting someone directly, like there's mavens, there's like super connectors, there's influencers within groups. Do you also identify those people and then have messaging come from them as well?
Richard, in my opinion, those folks don't really exist anymore. You have some folks who might be kind of a digital influencer and such these days. But if you were to look, even as recently as the 1970s, in the 1970s, as many as 70% of Americans were civically engaged, right? These were the folks who went to political party meetings and were members of the Moose Lodge and the Elks Lodge and the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club, in all these kind of civic organizations, the JCs, whatever it might be. And in the time, right, and call it as recently as the 70s, people would go to their friend who was in the Rotary Club and attended all the local Democratic Party meetings or Republican Party meetings. And they knew all the candidates. And they said, hey, I want your opinion. I don't know who to vote for tax assessor, or I don't know who to vote for Congress. Can you tell me what you think? In this day and age, less than 2% of Americans are civically active. If you were to, I always tell my candidates this, my candidates, they want to go to all these events and shake hands and meet all of these people. And at best case scenario, in a primary, you're going to meet 2% of your primary electorate because Americans just are not as civically engaged as they once were.
Well, that's an understatement. You said it went from 70% to 2%?
Yep. At its highest, it was
God.
at 70%. It stagnated at 50% and then started to rapidly decline. So there are about 2% of Americans who are actively and civically engaged.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And that's what it goes back to is targeting the individual voters, right? We don't have the budget to turn these folks out. We don't have the campaign resources to go and shake every single hand, right? There was a time where you could win a state house seat by truly going and shaking every hand. You could go to every event in your district and you would meet 70% of the voters because they were so civically engaged. And in some parts of the country, it literally became a sport, right? It was the most exciting attraction around when a political candidate would come to town on say a train stop or something like that. And you just don't see that in today's day and age.
So what moves people then? Just personalized ads, or I mean, are you I don't know. How do you sway people if they don't ask friends? And I guess if they don't really, unfortunately, there's no like Google 5-star ratings for politicians, which I don't know if anyone can get above like a half a star. But how do you sway people now if they don't seem to listen to anybody? I usually talk to them directly through their device, and that just controls everything they do, say, think, and it's weird.
So what we do is it's all a process, right? So we know who's going to vote with a high degree of certainty. We know how people feel about certain issues with a high degree of certainty. Now it's all about putting a simple equation. My candidate agrees with you on this issue, vote for my candidate. And it becomes very simple like that. And even on issues, if I'm not working a traditional political campaign, a candidate for office, say I'm working a ballot measure. We did some work on ballot measures that opposed ranked choice voting here in Nevada. So when we're talking about that, we know through data modeling with a high degree of certainty who cares about ranked choice voting, right? Who's opposed to it? Who supports it? Who's not going to vote for it no matter what happens? And it's turning those folks out. It's a turnout game at this point. You already know who's going to be there. It's about getting as many on your side as possible.
Yeah, it's just strange. It's amazing what has happened to people. Have you found that I would guess in studying all these factors that you would not only know who someone's going to vote for, but products they're going to buy, places they'll go vacation. I mean, there's a lot of probably side or ancillary data. What happens to that?
And that's the data that I, don't care as much about, right? Because I'm using mine to make election decisions. And now if I'm, Coca-Cola or some large Fortune 500 company, that's absolutely right. I can, with a high degree of certainty, tell them if they're going to use my product. If I'm a movie theater, I know who goes to the movie theater. All of everything that you do is sold, right? Every magazine you subscribe to, every newsletter you subscribe to, every store that you go and sign up to their email list, all of your credit card purchase history, all of this stuff is sold, right? There is nothing that you do that's in secret these days. And so what we're able to do is if I'm selling a certain product, I can literally say, I want to purchase data on people who purchase this kind of product and target all of my ads towards just that individual. Companies have gotten so high tech with this kind of thing that they know that if you're in their store, because they've kind of geo-targeted you within their store, and then they match it with credit card purchase history, and with a high degree of certainty, they can tell that you were in their store without purchasing something. And then the next thing you know, you get on some kind of social media platform or wherever you might see an ad, and you're going to have an ad from the store that you were just in offering you a coupon for 20% off.
So what's more powerful, to say that candidate X, supports your issue, or to say that candidate Y, that devil in the blue dress or whatever,